The afternoon sun glinted off the wings of Flight 447 as passengers boarded the massive aircraft bound for Los Angeles. In the first-class cabin, Marcus Wellington settled into seat 2A with the practiced ease of someone who flew premium class every week. At 52, with silver temples and a $15,000 suit, Marcus was the founder and CEO of Wellington Capital, a venture firm that managed over $3 billion in assets. He pulled out his laptop, ready to work on the presentation that would secure a $50 million partnership with Pacific Airways, the very airline he was flying today. Everything was proceeding according to plan until he saw who was being seated next to him. A young woman, perhaps 25, wearing worn jeans and a faded sweatshirt, carrying a baby in a simple cloth carrier, was being directed to seat 2B by the flight attendant. Marcus's face tightened with displeasure. From which city in the world are you watching this story unfold today? If tales of hidden tests and humbling revelations resonate with you, consider subscribing for more stories where nothing is quite what it seems. Excuse me, Marcus said sharply to the flight attendant, a professional-looking woman named Jennifer. There must be some mistake. This is first class. The attendant smiled politely. No mistake, sir. This passenger has a valid first-class ticket. Marcus looked at the young woman again, taking in her scuffed sneakers and the baby carrier that had seen better days. His eyes narrowed with suspicion and something darker, prejudice born from years of assuming that wealth and worth went hand in hand. The young woman, whose real name was Emma Chen, though Marcus didn't bother to ask, settled into her seat quietly. The baby, a 6-month-old girl named Lily, was sleeping peacefully against her mother's chest. Emma pulled out a small bag of baby supplies and began organizing them in the seat pocket, her movements efficient despite her obvious exhaustion. Marcus leaned over the armrest, his voice low but dripping with condescension. First time flying first class? He asked, though it wasn't really a question. Emma looked at him with calm brown eyes. No, she replied simply, returning her attention to her baby. Marcus's jaw clenched. The audacity of this woman, he thought. Clearly, she doesn't belong here. Probably used points or some promotional ticket. The real question was why Pacific Airways would allow someone like her to devalue the first-class experience for paying customers like himself. As the plane prepared for departure, Marcus flagged down Jennifer again. Is there any way I could be moved to another seat? He asked, not bothering to lower his voice. I have important work to do, and I can't have distractions. Jennifer glanced at Emma, who was gently rocking the baby. I'm sorry, sir, but first class is completely full today. Perhaps I can bring you noise-canceling headphones? Marcus's face reddened. That's not the point. I paid $4,000 for this ticket. I expect a certain level of comfort and... He paused, searching for a word that wouldn't sound overtly discriminatory. Atmosphere. Emma shifted in her seat, and Lily made a small cooing sound. Marcus immediately tensed, as if the baby had committed some terrible offense. Sir, Jennifer said, her professional smile tightening slightly, all our passengers have valid tickets. If you're uncomfortable, I can see if there are any seats available in business class. I'm not moving to business class, Marcus snapped. I paid for first class. She's the one who doesn't belong here. The cabin had grown quiet. Other first-class passengers were pretending not to listen, their eyes fixed on phones and magazines, but Marcus could feel their attention. Good, he thought. Let them see that someone is willing to speak up about declining standards. Emma finally looked directly at Marcus. Is there a problem, sir? She asked, her voice gentle but steady. Marcus scoffed. The problem is that this is first class. It's meant for business professionals, not. He gestured vaguely at her clothing and the baby. Not whatever situation you're in. Emma's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, not anger, but something else. Recognition, perhaps. Or confirmation. I have as much right to be here as you do, she said quietly. My ticket is valid. Before Marcus could respond, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their departure. Jennifer, looking relieved for the interruption, quickly made her way to her jump seat for takeoff. As the plane taxied to the runway, Marcus fumed silently. This was unacceptable. Pacific Airways was about to become his firm's newest investment partner, and this was how they treated their premium cabin. Allowing it to be overrun by people who clearly couldn't afford it under normal circumstances. The plane took off smoothly, climbing through the clouds until they reached cruising altitude. As soon as the seatbelt sign dinged off, Marcus reopened his laptop, determined to ignore his seatmate and focus on his work. But 15 minutes later, Lily woke up and began to fuss. Emma immediately began the delicate dance that all parents know, gentle bouncing, soft shushing, checking the diaper, offering a pacifier. But Lily, who had been sleeping through her usual feeding time, was hungry and not about to be consoled by anything except milk. "I'm so sorry," Emma said quietly to Marcus as she prepared to nurse the baby under a light blanket. "This will only take a few minutes." Marcus's face contorted with disgust. "You can't be serious. This is a public space. A first-class cabin. There are bathrooms. Have you ever tried to breastfeed in an airplane bathroom?" Emma asked, her voice still calm but with an edge now. "It's unsanitary and dangerous during turbulence. What I'm doing is completely legal and natural." Marcus stood up abruptly and marched to the galley where Jennifer was preparing drinks. "This is completely unacceptable," he announced loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "That woman is breastfeeding. In first class." Jennifer's expression remained professional, though Marcus could see her jaw tighten. "Sir, breastfeeding is protected by law. Passengers are allowed to nurse their babies anywhere on the aircraft." "I don't care what the law says," Marcus snapped. "I'm a potential major investor in this airline. I'm meeting with your CEO in Los Angeles about a $50 million partnership. Is this really how Pacific Airways wants to treat its VIP passengers?" "Let me get the senior flight attendant," Jennifer said, disappearing into the forward galley. Within moments, a man in his 50s with a calm, authoritative presence approached Marcus. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wellington," he said, and Marcus was momentarily surprised that the man knew his name. "I'm Robert, the senior purser. I understand you have some concerns." Finally, Marcus thought, someone who understands the situation. "Yes, I have serious concerns about the standards in your first-class cabin. That woman," he pointed toward Emma, "clearly doesn't belong here. She's traveling with a baby, she's breastfeeding in public, and frankly, her appearance suggests she's using some kind of promotional ticket. This degrades the experience for paying customers like myself." Robert nodded thoughtfully, his face unreadable. "I see. And you're concerned this reflects poorly on Pacific Airways?" "Exactly," Marcus said, feeling vindicated. "If this is how you operate, I'm going to have serious reservations about my firm's investment." Robert was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Wellington, did you know that Pacific Airways has been running a special program this month?" "What kind of program?" Marcus asked suspiciously. "A customer experience initiative," Robert explained. "We've been conducting random assessments to evaluate how our staff and passengers respond to various situations. Our CEO is very interested in ensuring that Pacific Airways maintains the highest standards of service and inclusivity." Marcus felt a small twinge of unease but pushed it aside. "Well, you're failing spectacularly. That woman is clearly not a typical first-class passenger." Robert's expression didn't change. "Interesting. What makes you say that?" Marcus gestured impatiently. "Look at her. The worn clothing, the baby, the whole situation. She's obviously not someone who regularly flies premium class." "So you're making assumptions based on her appearance?" Robert asked quietly. Marcus felt his face redden. "I'm making observations based on decades of business travel. There's a certain type of person who belongs in first class, and she's not it." Robert nodded slowly. I see. Thank you for sharing your perspective, Mr. Wellington. I'll make sure it's documented in our report. Before Marcus could ask what report he meant, Robert walked away, leaving Marcus with an uncomfortable feeling he couldn't quite name. Returning to his seat, Marcus found Emma had finished nursing and Lily was sleeping peacefully again. Emma had pulled out a worn paperback book and was reading quietly, occasionally glancing at her baby with the tender expression of a devoted mother. Marcus tried to return to his work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something about this situation was bothering him beyond the immediate irritation. The way Robert had questioned him, the mention of some assessment program, the fact that they seemed to know his name before he'd introduced himself. 2 hours into the flight, Jennifer came by with the beverage service. "Champagne, Mr. Wellington?" she asked. Marcus nodded curtly. "And for you, ma'am?" she asked Emma with a warm smile. "Just water, please," Emma replied. "I'm still nursing." As Jennifer poured the drinks, Marcus couldn't help himself. "You know," he said to Emma, "I don't understand why someone in your situation would waste money on a first-class ticket. Surely economy would be more practical." Emma looked at him with those calm brown eyes again. "Who says I paid for it?" Marcus felt a surge of vindication. "So it was a promotional ticket." "I knew it. Pacific Airways is really lowering their standards." Emma didn't respond, just returned to her book. But Marcus was on a roll now, his frustration with the entire situation boiling over. "This is exactly what's wrong with airlines today," he continued, loud enough that other passengers could hear. "They devalue the premium experience by giving away seats to people who haven't earned them. First class should be reserved for people who have achieved something, who contribute to society, who actually deserve it." One of the other first-class passengers, an elderly man across the aisle, cleared his throat. "Excuse me, young man, but how do you know this woman hasn't achieved anything?" Marcus turned to him. "Look at her. The clothes, the baby, the obvious lack of refinement. She's clearly not a business professional." The elderly man's expression hardened. "Some of the most accomplished people I know dress simply. And having a child is hardly a sign of failure. It's a sign of responsibility." Marcus waved him off dismissively and turned back to his laptop. But he could feel the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The other passengers were no longer pretending not to listen. Some were watching him with clear disapproval. Fine, Marcus thought. Let them disapprove. When I'm sitting in a meeting with Pacific Airways CEO tomorrow, discussing my $50 million investment, we'll see who has the last laugh. The flight continued, and Marcus made several more complaints to the flight attendants, about Emma's presence, about Lily making small baby sounds, about the declining standards of the airline. Each complaint was noted with professional courtesy but no action. Emma, for her part, remained quiet and dignified, caring for her baby and reading her book, seemingly unbothered by Marcus's hostility. As they began their descent into Los Angeles, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing in approximately 15 minutes. I'd like to personally welcome all our passengers, especially those participating in our special customer experience program this month. Your feedback has been invaluable." Marcus barely registered the announcement, too focused on gathering his belongings and preparing to exit as quickly as possible. He had a car waiting and a dinner meeting to get to. But as the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, something unexpected happened. Instead of the usual procedure, the captain's voice came on again. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for just a moment after we reach the gate. We have a special announcement." Marcus sighed with irritation. More delays. The plane pulled up to the gate, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. But instead of passengers standing to retrieve their bags, everyone remained seated, looking around with curiosity. The cockpit door opened, and the captain emerged, a professional-looking woman in her 50s. But she wasn't alone. Behind her was a distinguished man in an expensive suit, probably in his mid-60s, with an air of unmistakable authority. Marcus recognized him immediately from the photos in Pacific Airways' annual report. It was Richard Chen, the founder and CEO of Pacific Airways, one of the most successful airline executives in the industry. Marcus's heart began to race. This was unexpected. Was Chen personally greeting him because of the investment meeting tomorrow? The CEO walked down the aisle, and Marcus straightened in his seat, preparing to introduce himself. But Chen walked right past him. He stopped at row 2 and looked down at Emma, who was cradling Lily. His stern expression softened into a warm smile. "There's my girl," he said gently. Marcus watched in confusion as Emma stood up, and to his absolute shock, embraced the CEO. "Dad," she said quietly. "It's done." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. "Dad?" Richard Chen turned to face the cabin, and specifically, to face Marcus. His expression was no longer warm. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chen began, his voice carrying easily through the silent cabin, "I want to thank you for participating in Pacific Airways' Customer Experience Initiative. For the past month, we've been conducting anonymous tests on random flights to evaluate how our passengers treat each other, especially in premium cabins." He gestured to Emma. "This is my daughter, Emma Chen. She's a graduate of Harvard Business School and serves as Pacific Airways Vice President of Customer Experience. For the past 3 weeks, she's been flying on our aircraft dressed as an ordinary passenger, sometimes with her baby, sometimes alone, to see how people respond when they can't immediately identify someone's status or wealth." Marcus felt like he was going to be sick. The worn clothes, the simple baby carrier, the whole situation, it had all been a test. And he had failed spectacularly. Richard Chen continued, "We believe that true luxury isn't just about champagne and comfortable seats. It's about treating every human being with dignity and respect, regardless of how they look or what they're wearing." Unfortunately, his eyes locked on Marcus. "Some of our passengers today failed that basic test of human decency." Marcus wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor of the aircraft and vanish. Around him, other first-class passengers were looking at him with expressions ranging from pity to outright contempt. "Mr. Wellington," Chen said, addressing him directly now, "I believe you have a meeting scheduled with me tomorrow to discuss a potential investment partnership." Marcus could barely speak. "Yes, I can explain." "There's nothing to explain," Chen cut him off. "Your behavior today has shown me everything I need to know about your values and character. You made assumptions based on appearance. You complained repeatedly about a mother caring for her baby. You suggested that my daughter didn't deserve to be in first class because she wasn't dressed to your standards." Chen's voice grew harder. "Pacific Airways is building a company based on inclusion, respect, and human dignity. We don't need partners who view other human beings as less worthy based on their clothing or circumstances. Your firm's investment is no longer welcome." The cabin was absolutely silent except for the sound of Lily cooing softly in Emma's arms. Marcus tried to speak, to apologize, to salvage the situation, but no words came. He had just lost a $50 million deal because of his own prejudice and arrogance. Emma spoke for the first time since her father had arrived, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Wellington, you spent this entire flight making me feel unwelcome. You complained about my presence, my baby, my appearance. You never once considered that I might be a person of value, that I might have earned my place in that seat just as much as you have." She adjusted Lily in her arms. "My father built this airline on the principle that how we treat the least powerful among us reveals our true character. Today, you revealed yours." Richard Chen turned to address the whole cabin again. "To the passengers who showed kindness to my daughter today, who smiled at her baby or offered a helping hand, Pacific Airways wants to thank you. You'll find vouchers for future travel in your email this evening. As for our staff," he nodded to Jennifer and Robert, "you handled a difficult situation with professionalism and grace. Well done." Then Chen looked back at Marcus one final time. "Mr. Wellington, I suggest you use this flight as a learning experience. Wealth and success mean nothing if they don't come with compassion and humility. Marcus sat frozen as the CEO and his daughter walked off the plane together, Lily sleeping peacefully in Emma's arms. Around him, other passengers began to deplane, some shooting him looks of disgust or disappointment as they passed. The elderly gentleman who had defended Emma earlier stopped at Marcus's row. "You know, son," he said quietly, "I'm a retired federal judge. I've seen a lot of ugly behavior in my time. But watching someone destroy a $50 million opportunity because they couldn't see past their own prejudice. That's a new one." He shook his head sadly and walked away. Marcus finally stood on shaking legs and retrieved his bag from the overhead compartment. His phone was already buzzing with messages, his partners at Wellington Capital, who had somehow already heard what happened. The airline industry was a small world, and news traveled fast. As he walked through the terminal, Marcus's mind raced through everything he'd said and done on that flight. Every complaint, every dismissive comment, every assumption he'd made about Emma based on her appearance. It had all been documented, witnessed by a cabin full of passengers, and now it was going to follow him for the rest of his career. He had prided himself on being a successful businessman, someone who could read people and situations. But he'd been completely blind to the test happening right in front of him. Worse, he'd revealed himself to be exactly the kind of person he would never want to do business with, judgmental, prejudiced, and cruel. 3 days later, the story had gone viral. Someone on the flight had posted about the incident on social media, and it had been picked up by major news outlets. Venture capitalist loses $50 million deal after insulting CEO's daughter on flight, read the headlines. Marcus's firm was in crisis mode. 2 of his major investors had pulled their funding, citing values misalignment. 3 portfolio companies had requested new lead investors. His partners were discussing whether to force him out entirely. But the worst part wasn't the professional fallout. It was watching the interview that Emma Chen gave to a business news network, where she spoke with eloquence and compassion about the purpose of Pacific Airways' initiative. "We weren't trying to trick anyone," Emma explained to the interviewer, her baby on her lap. "We were simply seeing how people behave when they can't immediately identify someone's status or wealth. Because that's when you see someone's true character." The interviewer asked, "What did you learn from this experience?" Emma's expression grew thoughtful. "I learned that there are still so many people who equate worth with wealth, who believe that respect should only be given to those who look successful. But I also learned that there are far more people who show kindness regardless of circumstance. For every passenger like Mr. Wellington, there were 3 others who smiled at my baby or asked if I needed help. Those are the people we want flying Pacific Airways." The interview went on to discuss Pacific Airways' plans to expand their inclusion training and to continue the customer experience initiative on a permanent basis. Emma had become a somewhat reluctant spokesperson for treating all people with dignity, regardless of their appearance. 6 months later, Marcus Wellington sat in a much smaller office than the one he used to occupy. Wellington Capital had dissolved after the scandal, and he'd been forced to start over with a tiny boutique firm. Most of his old contacts wouldn't return his calls. The venture capital world had a long memory. But something had changed in Marcus during those 6 months. The shame and humiliation had slowly transformed into something else, genuine reflection and a painful recognition of his own failures. He'd spent weeks reading, thinking, and confronting the prejudices he'd carried his entire life without acknowledging them. One afternoon, Marcus did something he'd been contemplating for months. He wrote a letter to Emma Chen. It wasn't an excuse or a justification. It was a simple, honest apology and an acknowledgement of what he'd learned. "I spent my entire life believing that success was about being in the right rooms with the right people," Marcus wrote. "But that flight taught me that I was the wrong person, someone who judged others based on superficial criteria and missed the humanity right in front of me. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that your father's lesson, painful as it was, may have been the most valuable education I've ever received." He didn't expect a response, and he didn't receive one. But 3 weeks later, Marcus received an email from Pacific Airways' HR department. It was an invitation to attend one of their inclusion and bias training sessions, not as a potential investor, but as a participant in a program they were developing for corporate leaders. Marcus accepted immediately. The training was humbling and difficult, forcing him to confront beliefs and behaviors he'd never questioned. But it was also enlightening, showing him perspectives he'd never considered. At the end of the week-long intensive program, Richard Chen himself appeared to address the participants. "Some of you are here because you made mistakes," Chen said, his eyes briefly meeting Marcus's. "That's actually the best reason to be here. People who think they have nothing to learn are the ones who need these lessons most." He paused, letting that sink in. Pacific Airways doesn't believe in permanent cancellation. We believe in growth, learning, and genuine change. But that change has to be real, not performative. It has to start with honest self-examination and a commitment to doing better. After the session ended, Marcus approached Chen hesitantly. "Mr. Chen, I want to thank you for allowing me to participate in this program." "I know I don't deserve," Chen held up a hand, cutting him off. "Mr. Wellington, what you deserve isn't my concern. What matters is whether you're genuinely committed to change. Are you?" Marcus took a deep breath. "Yes. I am. I can't undo what I said or how I behaved. But I can work every day to be better than I was on that flight." Chen studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "That's all anyone can ask. The work is what matters, not the words." As Marcus left the Pacific Airways training center, he didn't feel absolved or forgiven. He felt something else, accountable. He had a long road ahead, rebuilding his reputation and, more importantly, rebuilding himself into someone whose values matched his ambitions. The flight that was supposed to lead to his biggest deal had instead led to his biggest failure. But in that failure, Marcus Wellington had finally learned what Emma Chen and her father already knew, that true first-class treatment isn't about the seat you're sitting in, it's about how you treat the person sitting next to you. 1 year after the incident, Marcus received another unexpected email. It was from Emma Chen. "Mr. Wellington," it read, "my father told me you completed our inclusion training program and have been volunteering with organizations that promote equity in business. I wanted to acknowledge that growth. Real change is rare, and I respect the work you've been doing." She went on to explain that Pacific Airways was launching a new initiative to help reformed business leaders make amends through action, not just words. They were offering Marcus a chance to participate, not as an investor, but as a mentor to young entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities. Marcus read the email 3 times, his eyes stinging with emotion he didn't try to hide. This wasn't redemption, he knew he didn't deserve that. But it was a chance to take his painful lesson and turn it into something meaningful for others. He accepted immediately. 2 years after the flight, Marcus stood in front of a room full of young entrepreneurs at a Pacific Airways-sponsored summit. He'd been asked to share his story as a cautionary tale and, hopefully, as evidence that people could change. "I'm going to tell you about the worst day of my professional life," Marcus began, "and the best thing that ever happened to me." He told them everything, the assumptions he'd made, the complaints he'd filed, the $50 million deal he'd lost because he couldn't see past his own prejudice. The room was silent as he spoke. "When I saw a young mother in worn clothes sitting next to me in first class," Marcus said, "I made every wrong assumption possible. I never considered that she might be brilliant, accomplished, or testing me. I only saw what I expected to see, someone I deemed unworthy of being there." He paused, meeting the eyes of the diverse group of young people in front of him. "The truth is, I was the one who was unworthy. Unworthy of that seat, unworthy of that business deal, and unworthy of calling myself a leader. Because real leaders don't judge people by their appearance or circumstances. Real leaders recognize potential and worth in everyone." After the session, a young woman approached Marcus. She was perhaps 25, dressed simply, with a quiet intensity in her eyes. "Mr. Wellington, I just want to say thank you. I've been in so many meetings where people like you," she paused, reconsidering her words, where people made assumptions about me based on how I look. It helps to know that some people can learn and change. Marcus looked at her thoughtfully. Can I ask what you do? I'm developing an AI platform for medical diagnostics, she replied. I'm trying to raise my first round of funding, but most VCs won't take me seriously because I'm young, I'm a woman, and I don't fit their image of a tech founder. Marcus felt a familiar shame wash over him. This was exactly the kind of person he would have dismissed 3 years ago. Would you be willing to send me your pitch deck? He asked. I can't promise anything, but I have some contacts in the healthcare tech space who might be interested. The young woman's eyes widened with surprise and hope. Really? After everything that happened to you, you're still willing to, especially after everything that happened to me, Marcus interrupted gently. That's exactly why I need to do better. As he drove home that evening, Marcus thought about the long, winding path that had brought him here. He'd lost his firm, his reputation, and $50 million in the span of one flight. But he'd gained something more valuable, the ability to see people as they truly were, not as he expected them to be. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from the young entrepreneur he'd met that day, sending her pitch deck. Marcus smiled and made a mental note to review it carefully that weekend. The next morning, Marcus had a video call scheduled with a potential investor for his rebuilt boutique firm. As the screen connected, he was surprised to see Richard Chen's face appear. Mr. Wellington, Chen said, his expression unreadable. I heard you've been making some significant changes in your approach to business. Marcus nodded, his heart racing. I'm trying, sir. Every day. Chen was quiet for a moment. My daughter told me about your work with young entrepreneurs at our summit last week. She was impressed. Marcus didn't know what to say, so he simply waited. I'm not calling to offer you a partnership, Chen continued. That ship has sailed. But I am calling to tell you that I respect what you've been doing. Real change is difficult, and most people who make the kind of mistakes you made simply double down on their prejudices. You chose a harder path. Thank you, Marcus said quietly. That means more than you know. Chen nodded. Keep doing the work, Mr. Wellington. That's what matters. As the call ended, Marcus sat back in his chair, a strange sense of peace settling over him. He would never get back what he'd lost on that flight 3 years ago. But he'd found something better, a purpose that went beyond profit, a mission that aligned with values he should have held all along. And somewhere in Los Angeles, Emma Chen was boarding another Pacific Airways flight, this time in her professional clothes, heading to a board meeting. But in her bag, she still carried the same worn baby carrier she'd used during the test. She kept it as a reminder that appearances reveal nothing about a person's worth, and that the most valuable lessons often come from the most unexpected sources. Have you ever judged someone based on their appearance? Have you ever assumed that the person in worn clothes or with a crying baby couldn't possibly be accomplished, intelligent, or deserving of respect? Marcus Wellington learned the hardest way possible that the poor mother sitting next to him was actually his potential business partner's daughter, and that his prejudice cost him everything. Sometimes the most expensive lessons are the ones that teach us to see the humanity in everyone, regardless of how they look or what they're wearing. And sometimes, losing everything is the only way to find what really matters.